Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Define Disaster. This is Battlefield 1. In today's video, we're going to be taking a closer look at the light tank. That is to say, we're going to be looking at all available loadouts for the light tank, the three in name. We're going to be looking at their function, purpose, ideal usage, and of course, which of them is the best for conquest on operations in Battlefield 1. Now before we get started, just a quick shout out to the 402 subscribers that I in the meantime have accumulated. We just recently, that is to say from yesterday to today, reached 400 subscribers, and I just wanted to give a big thank you from the bottom of my heart to all of you who have supported me both more recently or over a longer stretch of time, and also of course a welcome to all of those new subscribers here to the Disastrous crew. I hope you find the content and community enjoyable. With that being said though, down to the topic of today's video, light tanks. Now there is a certain amount of functionality to a light tank, and there are certain things light tanks are generally just not quite as good as for example something like a heavy tank or a medium tank. Just to start off with a little bit more of a general information and introduction before we get into the specifics of which tank is best for what reasons. What is a light tank great for doing, or tanks in general? Well, first of all, there's two functions in my opinion, key functions of a tank. One is to soak up attention and damage, and the other one is to dish out damage. Now, it may seem relatively simple, but this differs very much in your choice of tank and the way it performs at those two tasks. To give just a rough example, a light tank is generally much more geared towards dishing out damage. It can't really take that much damage before it blows up. Something like a heavy tank, on the other hand, while equally capable of dealing out massive amounts of damage, is best used on a point where it can just soak up ridiculous amounts of grenades, rockets, and attention from your enemy, allowing your infantry to push up on the point and maybe even taking out the unsuspecting enemies. It creates a diversion tank in a sense, and at the same time provides cover fire for your infantry. Now that is the key function of a tank, at least in my opinion. And as I've said, the light tank very much specializes in the second of those two functions, in that it is much better at dishing out damage than taking damage. With that being said though, let's move on to the three available tank loadouts in Battlefield 1. The Howitzer, the close support tank, and the flanker tank. Now the Howitzer is probably my least favorite light tank in Battlefield 1, the least favorite loadout, and frankly it doesn't fit my playstyle. I don't think it's very effective. Nevertheless, there is some key strengths and key advantages to using the Howitzer loadout for the light tank over something like the close support or flanker version. Now one of those key advantages is the amount of damage it can deal and dish out to enemy armor. Now we just said the light tank doesn't necessarily specialize so much in taking or dealing out damage, especially against enemy armor, but it does necessarily have to do so on an everyday basis on a battlefield. Whether or not you want to or not, the enemy's going to have tanks, and you're going to have to deal with those tanks as tank driver. It is, after all, your responsibility. The Howitzer excels at this, doing a huge amount of damage when compared to the other light tanks against enemy armor. This comes, of course, at a price. One of those prices is the fact that the shot, the Howitzer's primary shot, has an absolutely insane amount of drop, which means at longer ranges, you're going to have a hard time unless you practice a significant amount with this tank to actually hit your shots and kill your enemies. A further disadvantage of the Howitzer light tank loadout is the fact that it is a fixed gun emplacement. What I'm meaning to say here is there's no turret to move around your gun. Well, this isn't a problem if the enemy is directly in front of you. If you get flanked by infantry, which in my opinion is the more frequent way to get taken out in a light tank, you're more or less helpless. You have a long amount of time needed to actually turn around your tank to face the enemy. You're very inflexible regarding targets coming to you from the side and especially behind. So basically you have to take the long distance camp approach. You've got to be on the side of a map, side of an objective, and can't really move into the objective because you will by definition get flanked. Furthermore, on maps, conquest maps in particular, where there are objectives where enemies can maybe come from all directions, I'm thinking here maybe of Sinai Desert, objective C or D, you're much in a situation where you're actually pretty much helpless. If the enemies have that point surrounded, or at least they have the possibility to come from all directions, you can never really be safe that you're not going to get flanked and taken out. This is a disadvantage that the other two tanks that we'll be looking at don't have, and thus is somewhat of a letdown when you're using this tank. You don't have more health like some of the other heavier tanks which don't have a turret to compensate for this. You're easier to take out and you're very immobile when it comes to shooting targets that aren't right in front of you. One last thing though to mention about the Howitzer is that it does have a relatively nice anti-infantry weapon. Its secondary is a machine gun, which is a lot easier and more effective to use against infantry also at range than something like the scatter shot of the close support tank. Speaking of the close support tank though, this is somewhat in between the flanker tank and the howitzer tank when it comes to effective ratio between infantry and armor. It's very effective at both, that is to say. Now, one of the key advantages of the close support tank over something like the howitzer is that it has a turret, making it a lot more flexible and a lot more easier to get on objectives, take people out left, right, and center. Furthermore, this tank is the starting tank, so in one point or another, you're going to have to use this light tank at one point, unless you're just going to go for the heavy tank until you've leveled up enough to get some of the other tanks. Furthermore, another point to note about this tank and what makes it very strong is it's very good up close. Now, this is suggested by the name as well, but there's a number of reasons for this. Frankly, specifically regarding the scatter shot for infantry, it's a humongous amount of damage up close. The downside to this is, however, since the patch, or since actually the full game is out, it got nerfed in the beta, the light tank, this tank doesn't do a lot of damage to infantry at long range with a scatter shot. You're going to have to rely on your primary, which is a lot harder to actually hit your targets because it's got, of course, quite a bit of bullet drop to it. Meaning, if you're in close quarter, you can be effective. At long range, you're not. Furthermore, though, in close quarter, you're very much limited by the amount of ammunition that you have. Reloading, or I should rather say resupplying this tank, takes a long time. So if you're in the thick of it, you run out of bullets, you're in trouble with this tank, because frankly, it's going to take you a long time to get a shot or two back, and with a shot, you can usually just kill one single piece of infantry, meaning if a whole squad actually walks up on you, you're basically out of luck. Now, that doesn't mean that this tank is useless, and as you probably all will know and have used this tank yourself, it's relatively effective at what it does. Furthermore, a last point to notice, or advantage, while at the same time being a disadvantage, depending on how you look at it, is it deals all its damage in a single shot. What I mean by this, if you're behind a piece of cover, taking on an enemy tank approaching, you can pop out, shoot your shot, get behind cover again while you wait for the next shot to be put in your chamber, to be loaded up for you to shoot. Unlike, for example, something like the flanker tank, which would have to expose itself a little bit longer to shoot all of its rounds through, because they, of course, they come in rapid succession. Speaking of that flanker tank, let's move on to that. Frankly, my favorite light tank loadout available, and I think the reasons will be highlighted in the following. But first, before we get into all the positives that come with this tank, one of the negatives, already basically alluded to a little bit when talking about the close support tank. Frankly, when you deal your damage, it's progressive. You have to shoot all your shots. You've got 15 rounds, and it's going to take some time for them to all be shot. Using the close support tank to take out a tank is quicker in the amount of time you have to expose yourself to possible enemy fire. On the other hand, there's a number of advantages that come with having 15 less damaging rounds versus 1 heavily damaging rounds. One of those is regarding actually finding out how much you have to lead a target, either in the vertical or in the horizontal sense. You can test fire 1 or 2 shots, and if you miss them, it's not a big deal. By then you'll know how much you have to, for example, lead over an enemy tank's head to hit them at longer range, and the rest of your shots will hit, only minimizing your damage, say, by roughly 10%. In the case of something like the howitzer or the close support tank, you'd be missing out 100% damage if you don't hit the first shot. In other words, it's a little bit more friendly to those who don't constantly play tank and are fully aware of how their tank operates and how much they have to lead a shot. Another point, and in my opinion this is the strongest point of this tank, is its anti-infantry capabilities. They are simply beyond any of the other tanks in the game, period, I would actually argue. They are phenomenal. The scatter shot, which you have 15 shots on this tank, can basically take somebody out across the entire map. Now, not with a single shot, but given that this is a rapid firing cannon basically that you have on top of this tank, you just use 3, 4, maybe even 10 of your shots, and you'll still take out that prone camping sniper somewhere 250 meters away. And this is not really an exaggeration. You can pretty much take somebody out as long as you can see them with this tank if they're in an infantry state. With that being said, there's another advantage to consider with this mode of firing, having less damaging bullets but multiple of them. And the fact is that the damage per second of the flanker tank, the damage per minute per second that you put out with the flanker tank, is higher than that of, for example, the close support tank. And this comes down to the mechanism. In the close support tank, you fire your shot, you rechamber, you fire again until you fire through all 4 of yours, and then you have to resupply. And this is the key here. Basically, there's no rechambering in the case of the flanker tank, just resupplying. And the resupplying of the flanker tank is a lot faster. So in essence, when you use the flanker tank, you fire your 15 rounds, it takes you about a second or two to rechamber or resupply, and you're back to go. You don't have to wait a longer amount of time. So this can be compared, basically, the flanker tank constantly does as much damage as the close support tank would if it had an infinite amount of supplied ammunition. So fire, rechamber continuously. So in essence, in longer firefights or firefights where you're engaging multiple amounts of infantry, you don't run out of bullets. You're not suddenly in a position where you can't shoot anymore, which is the big disadvantage of the close support tank, which often you will find yourself in that position. You take out 3-4 pieces of infantry and you've got no more ammunition. There may be somebody dancing around right in front of you, but there's not much you could do other than maybe try and roadkill them. With that being said, I think my conclusion is going to be pretty obvious here. For a number of different reasons, which I've listed, I find the flanker tank to be more versatile and more effective, especially against infantry, and pretty much equally effective against armor. Another thing I'd mention, in case you don't know, the flanker tank does a ridiculous amount of damage against enemy aircraft or the airship in relative close proximity with its scatter shot. This tank can be relatively equally effective to an AA against something like a behemoth, and relatively effective against passing enemy aircraft, especially if there's 2 on them. And this is what me and my friend like to occasionally do. Both get a light tank, get on somewhere, watch a bomber come in, and just completely destroy them if they're low enough to hit. So this is just another benefit of this tank. Its flexibility, in my opinion, is really what makes it so strong. Yes, a Howitzer may be better at dedicated armor support, but you find yourself facing both armor and infantry on the battlefield, and something like the close support tank is just constantly begging for more shots because you've killed too many people and don't have enough to engage for the rest of the squad. So in my opinion, I'd always use the flanker tank, but feel free to leave down below in the comments your experiences and your opinions on this matter. How do you use the light tank in Battlefield 1? Have I missed some kind of key advantage, strategy, or technique to make one of the other tanks that I maybe don't prefer over something like the light tank more effective? Feel free to leave that down below, as well, of course, your video suggestions for future Battlefield 1 or Battlefield 4 videos. But with that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 1 video.